Hosting our event is Dr. Stephen Bucci, who is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is well-versed in special operations and cybersecurity, as well as defense support to civil authorities. He served as a military assistant to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld for 5.5 years and continued at the Pentagon upon retirement as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. He is an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason and an associate professor of terrorism studies and cybersecurity policy at Long Island University. Please join me in welcoming Steve Bucci. Steve? Thanks.
All right, let me add my welcome to everyone that's here in the building and those coming in online. I'm going to give very quick introductions to the 3 gentlemen here to my left because I've known them all for quite a while. I normally have to really work at introductions. This one wasn't quite as hard as most, but I think you're going to enjoy what they talk about and the key points they're going to bring up. First up will be David and Sarah. David is a policy analyst here at the Heritage Foundation who works in my organization, the Allison Center. He is my lead for Homeland Security and cyber and the various issues associated with that. He's done quite a bit of writing about this subject, all of it very good, I know, because I have to read it all before he publishes it. And very, very fresh perspective on a lot of these things, particularly on how our nation responds to disasters. So he was a natural. Next to him is an old friend, Dan Kanuski. Dan is a former White House staffer during the Bush administration, and he is a senior fellow at George Washington University. And he has done a lot of this stuff, and he did some of these things at very, very tough times, took his job in the White House just before Katrina, Hurricane Katrina hit, so he sort of had a baptism by fire, and he has also done quite a bit of writing on this and was one of our lead guest authors for a report that Heritage put out with some of our allies in our response to the Ebola crisis from last year. And last but not least, a gentleman who I've known longer than David and about the same amount of time as Dan, who, I'll be honest with you, never knew what the heck his first name really was, because James Ross is a former Air Force pilot, and if anybody of you know Air Force pilots, they don't really use their first names. They get call signs and they use it forever. His is Coach, and in addition to his long service in the Air Force, he and I got to work together when I was in the Department of Defense as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, and Coach was one of the practitioners there, one of the full-time guys who make our government work. He is the Deputy Director for Defense Support of Civil Authorities and is an expert in all of the support that DoD provides to the rest of the government in responding to domestic incidents. So with that, each of these gentlemen are going to give you short opening remarks, and then we're going to spend the bulk of our time on Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, and I'll do this now so we just don't interrupt the flow when we're ready to start, we have some folks with microphones. I will designate whose question will get answered. Wait until you get the microphone. And then identify yourself and ask a question, please. If I don't hear a question mark after 2 sentences, I'll ask you to sit down. So we want to give the opportunity of these gentlemen to share their wisdom and their imagination in some cases. So we'll do that. So with that, David, you get started.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Steve mentioned been doing a fair amount of writing on FEMA, so today I plan to be discussing FEMA's funding and how the decision is made to commit FEMA resources to a disaster. The current process has had some unintended consequences that I think have harmed the U.S.'s ability to respond to major disasters. How so? I would like to use an example sort of where fiction is imitating real life. So first, a spoiler alert, if you have not seen the current season of Netflix's House of Cards, I'm sorry, but it's been about half a year since it came out, so I'm going to go ahead and use the example anyway. But you should go and watch that. It's a really good example, so I need to use it. In the most recent season of House of Cards, President Francis Underwood is effectively a lame duck. He became president only after he managed to get the prior president to resign in disgrace out of fear of being impeached. So he needs some sort of bold idea to break out of this malaise, and he decides that he's going to do a massive jobs program that reforms entitlements and gives any American a job at the expense of the federal government. There's just one problem. Both parties in Congress and both houses of Congress aren't going to go for it. So he's not a man to take no for an answer, so what does he do? He looks for a unique solution. He, in connection with the mayor of D.C., will declare that unemployment is a disaster and will call forth FEMA funds to pay for jobs. In one episode, Underwood's aides read him text from FEMA's ruling statute, the Stafford Act, to tell him that he has wide discretion to determine what exactly a disaster is or is not. So while no one expects a real president to undertake such reckless and wrong actions, this fictional story portrays a key truth of the Stafford Act. The act makes it very easy for disasters to become federalized. Throughout most of the U.S.'s history, state and local governments were responsible for responding to nearly all disasters. Under President Reagan, FEMA averaged only about 28 federal disaster declarations a year. Following the passage of the Stafford Act in 1988, though, this number dramatically changed, with federal disaster declarations steadily rising so that under President George W. Bush and under President Obama, the U.S. has averaged around 130 federal disaster declarations a year. The result has been that FEMA now responds to a disaster every 2.8 days on average or so, and has needed more and more money to pay for the cost of responding to this increased amount of disaster responses. Now, some have said that this is happening because there are more disasters in the world. I don't think so, and I'll give you two alternative culprits for this, both of which are in the Stafford Act. First, the Act shifts about 75% of the disaster response costs to the federal government. In the event of a disaster, states normally have to pay for the costs of responding. But if the president declares the disaster a major disaster worthy of federal assistance, then 75% or more of the response costs are now covered by the federal government. The result has been that states now request federal help whenever they can, since it will bring federal dollars. This creates a vicious cycle as states responding to the increased federalization of disasters. They respond to this by preparing less, putting less money aside for disasters. As a result, they are less prepared and then need more federal assistance when the next disaster strikes, and this cycle takes on a life of its own. The second problematic provision of the Stafford Act makes it far too easy for states to request disaster assistance. The Act vaguely requires that a disaster be, quote, of such severity and magnitude that effective response is beyond the capability of the state and those local governments, and that federal assistance is necessary, end quote. This echoes Francis Underwood's determining that the federal assistance was necessary. The Stafford Act also requires that the storm-related damages be equal to approximately $1.4 per capita in the state. But for several states, that actually works out to less than $1 million. So in theory, there are some disasters that can be centered in one state, cost less than $1 million, and be considered a federal disaster. So this combination of easy-to-acquire federal assistance, together with the substantial monetary benefit from federal involvement, puts FEMA in very high demand, and it gives it an unhealthy operational tempo, leaving it unprepared both in terms of readiness and money for truly catastrophic disasters, which is exactly where FEMA is most needed. It has resulted in significant increases in federal expenditures as well, which, given the U.S.'s current fiscal woes, is a serious problem. So what do we do to fix this problem? The answer relies on returning more responsibility for localized disasters to the states. This will ensure that governments closest to the people are responsible for most disasters. This will take a significant load off of FEMA so that they can be prepared to respond to those catastrophic disasters that affect whole regions or the entire country. The way we do this is through two changes to the Stafford Act. First, Congress should reduce the federal share for FEMA disaster declarations to a maximum of 25% of the costs. This way, about 75% of the costs of a disaster are borne by the taxpayers living in the state or states that are affected by a disaster. For catastrophes with a nationwide or regional impact, such as 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, or the like, a relief provision could provide a higher federal cost share ratio, but only if it reaches a much higher threshold. Second, Congress should modify the Stafford Act to establish clear requirements that limit the situations in which FEMA can issue disaster declarations. This should include eliminating some types of disasters entirely from FEMA's portfolio, and really the easiest way to do this is to raise the minimum dollar threshold for requesting a disaster declaration. Increasing the per capita threshold to $3 per capita and properly indexing these funds for inflation would significantly reduce the number of events warranting a federal disaster declaration. Now, these actions may sound like they're just needlessly cutting or limiting the use of FEMA funds, but they are designed to support FEMA's ability to effectively respond and prioritize a finite amount of resources. It also returns preparedness to state and local governments, not only increasing their ability to handle local disasters, but it also makes them better prepared to handle larger ones as well. With each level of government better prepared for a disaster, the U.S. will be in a better position to handle whatever comes its way this hurricane season and beyond. And with that, turn over to Dan.
Great. Thanks for that excellent overview, David. I'm going to start my presentation with a little bit of a story. Let's rewind to July 2005. It was a Friday afternoon. I was sitting in my office at George Washington University, happily working, in the ivory tower, and I got a phone call, and it was from the White House. And the White House staffer said, "Good news. Your application's been approved. We want you to come work for us at the White House." Great. At some point, I managed to articulate, a question like, "When do you want me to start?" And they said, "Monday." Okay. And I specifically remember walking down the hall and handing in my letter of resignation at 5 p.m. on a Friday, effective immediately. Of course, everybody understood where I worked, and they were very supportive. And so first thing Monday morning, I walked into the White House, into the West Wing, sat down with my now boss, Fran Townsend, the President's Homeland Security Advisor. And she did her welcome, as she does, I'm sure, for every new staff member, and said, "Dan, we're really happy to have you here." And at some point she said, "So which job are you doing here?" At which point there was dead silence on my part. I said, "I don't know." Anyways, long story short, she said, "Why don't you do the Director of Response and Recovery? It's a pretty exciting job. You're basically the point man on all disasters here at the White House. I think you'd really enjoy it." Again, that's July 2005. Fast forward a few weeks, what happened? The worst natural disaster to occur on U.S. soil in my history, probably yours as well. So, there I was, Hurricane Katrina. I remember on that morning, the hurricane coming ashore. We knew little to nothing about the damage. We knew the potential for damage was extremely high. We knew that the forecasts were potentially catastrophic. But what we heard that morning was silence. In fact, hours later, it was around noon that day, there was an AP report, Associated Press report, that said that New Orleans had dodged a bullet. We had no information to the contrary and momentarily took a sigh of relief. Hours later, we started to get conflicting reports about damage, potentially some buildings destroyed in New Orleans. And then much later that night, I saw on TV, the first images that had been recorded a few hours earlier from a Coast Guard helicopter that showed catastrophic damage. So Katrina was a disaster and a disaster. It was a hurricane, but it was also a flood. And those two combined into a real catastrophe. Little did I know, again, at the time, that Hurricane Katrina would become not only the focus of my time that day, that week, that year, but for the 3 years I was in the White House, and basically the whole time since. I went on to do finish my PhD and did my dissertation on the lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina. actually assessed some of the progress that had been made, and revisited this report, which immediately after the disaster, again, Fran Townsend was tasked by the president to do a lessons learned report. And it was unprecedented. Unprecedented, I would say, in a few different areas, but one would be transparency. We wrote this report. We had access to all the data you can imagine, emails, mine, everybody's emails throughout the federal government at the time, to see if we could identify some of the key challenges from that hurricane and decide what we needed to address in the future. And so we did. We came up with 120, after reviewing the whole disaster, we then came up with 125 recommendations. I encourage you to find this on the web. It's the Federal Response to Hurricane Katrina Lessons Learned. You can Google it. And it's public. So again, very, very few times in our nation's history where there's been some time of something terrible happened in the United States, where the federal government reviewed itself very critically. We were very self-critical, and then made it publicly available so that everybody can evaluate our ability as a nation to respond to that disaster as well as future disasters. So now moving forward, we're almost at the 10-year anniversary here. Is the nation better prepared for a catastrophic disaster today than it was 10 years ago? Absolutely. Are we the best prepared we possibly could be? Probably not. And that's for two reasons. One, there are competing priorities, right? At the federal level, there's competing priorities for resources. Money's not unlimited. People are not unlimited. Organizations have to be balanced by needs and competing needs. And so FEMA is never going to have the funding necessary to respond perfectly to every imaginable disaster, especially those truly catastrophic disasters that are high consequence are also very low probability, right? So it's a disaster that may never happen, may never happen in our lifetime, but it's possible. And so how do you direct resources towards something like that that is high consequence, could have catastrophic results, but is very, very low probability? An asteroid striking the Earth, would be one, right? Even if we were perfectly prepared for that, I'm not sure we could, eliminate all the consequences. We couldn't eliminate all the consequences, obviously. But even to prepare adequately for an asteroid, it would bankrupt the entire U.S. federal government. So you have to make those decisions based on those competing priorities. Two, as David eloquently described, our system of government is founded on the belief that disasters are handled at the lowest jurisdictional level possible. And so, as David said, the local response, right? You pick up the phone, you dial 911, FEMA doesn't answer the phone, right? Your local 911 center does, and an ambulance or a fire truck or a police car, whatever your need is, it responds, and that's provided by the local government. So what I would say is no matter how much the federal government prepares for the next disaster, it's really not relevant. What's relevant is how prepared you are as an individual, as a community, or state and local governments, to help you in those times of need. In fact, the Stafford Act embraces the principle of federalism, right? The Stafford Act is synonymous with federalism. It says that disaster response is the responsibility of the governor. And when that governor needs assistance because his state is overwhelmed, then he goes to the president and makes a request, and that's called the disaster declaration process. And that's a process I oversaw for 3 years. And only then will the federal government provide support to those state and local authorities. But it's important to remember that the governor is always in charge, and even when the federal government provides assistance, they're providing that assistance in support of the governor. Also, FEMA is not a large agency. Most of its employees are part-time, and frankly, they're only as needed. They're called disaster reservists for a reason. A disaster reservist only gets activated during a disaster. So while they might have 14,000 employees, it's not like FEMA headquarters down the street here has 14,000 employees, not even close, right? Most of the staff there are processing payments from disasters, frankly, from disasters years ago. It takes a long time to pay out a disaster, to reimburse a state for costs associated with the disaster. And so FEMA does that. FEMA also provides assistance to state and local authorities in the form of training and exercising and funding associated with that, with Homeland Security grants. But we have to kind of take a step back and realize FEMA is not this standing force, right? They're not there ready to deploy and take over an incident. That's not their role. To the extent they have employees, they're generally activated during a disaster, like I said, and at all times they're in support of the governor. And before I turn it over to my colleague from DOD, DOD is a great partner of FEMA's. DOD provides assistance that FEMA may not have. But the same thing I'm saying about FEMA not taking charge, taking over the roles and responsibilities of state and local governments, it's the same for DOD. Right? So all these federal agencies, whether it be FEMA or DOD or the Health and Human Services or you name it, they're there to support the state and local government. So I'm happy to talk about other disasters or Katrina more in depth in the Q&A session, but I guess my closing thought would be my view is a cautionary one. Don't be guided by unrealistic expectations of FEMA's capabilities, and remember that the tenets of federalism are embodied in the Stafford Act. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here today. As you heard, the Department of Defense does have a key role to play when it comes to disaster response. The President and the American public have very high expectations for the Department of Defense that we will be there to deliver needed capabilities very quickly and early in an incident. The Department of Defense is well prepared and postured to execute that mission. We have made significant improvements, especially since Katrina, along those lines. We optimize a wide array of organizations and capabilities throughout the department when we respond to an event. Additionally, the governors have immediate access to their National Guard and the federal military equipment that they operate for state missions, and they can augment that response through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which enables state-to-state sharing of Guard forces and equipment. The Department of Defense is always going to be in support of domestic civilian authorities, as you've heard. The support's provided at all levels of government, local, state, tribal, and federal, and even sometimes to non-governmental organizations. DoD resources are typically used when response is beyond the capabilities of civil authorities, and support is normally provided on a reimbursable basis. It's important to remember that the Department of Defense is not appropriated for this mission. All the support that the department provides is reimbursed through the Stafford Act for the department, so that we do not take from our operations and maintenance budget to provide support to civil authorities. The Secretary of Defense will always retain command of those federal military forces that are operating in that support, and the total force is used. And when I say total force, I'm talking about the active component, which is what you see that deploys overseas all the time, as well as the reserve forces and the National Guard and our defense agencies. Three parts of the Department of Defense play a key role. One is the Army Corps of Engineers, the Defense Logistics Agency, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency are three of our organizations outside of the military departments that provide key support to civil authorities for disasters. As you've heard, the system is a system within systems. It's a true federalist system. The department provides that support, typically through FEMA, or it could be to other federal departments and agencies that in turn supports the states in their response efforts. And so we spend a lot of time in providing that support through the emergency support functions that FEMA has, the 14 emergency support functions, to leverage the capabilities of the federal government, of which the Department of Defense plays a key role in all 14 of the emergency support functions. When the department receives a request from FEMA or from any other federal agency, we evaluate that request against some criteria to determine the impact on the department and our ability to perform that mission. The first thing we look at is legality. Is it legal for the Department of Defense to take that action and to operate? Lethality is an important aspect also. The potential use of lethal force by or against DoD forces. And I think recent events in Chattanooga have made that lethality discussion brought to the forefront when you look at the Department of Defense operating within the United States. We look at risk and the safety to the DoD force. Costs are obviously something that we look at very closely because, again, we are not funded for that mission. We look at the impact on readiness. When we take a force and we use it for the DISCA mission, what is the impact on that readiness for the Department of Defense? Does that impact overseas deployments? Does it impact other areas of our mission for the aspects that the department has for defense of the United States? And then lastly, appropriateness. Is this something that the department should be doing? Or is it something that's better served to be provided elsewhere? Is that a capability that could be provided better by the private sector, or should the Department of Defense provide that? So the department has taken on a few initiatives and a few actions in order to better operationalize how we provide the support to civil authorities. We have a number of liaison officers and partnerships throughout the interagency. We have full-time personnel at FEMA headquarters working in the National Response Coordination Center from the Office of Secretary of Defense, where I work, as well as the Joint Staff, and also from U.S. Northern Command, which is the operational arm for the Department of Defense when it comes to operations in the United States. The DoD has a significant amount of expertise when it comes to planning, and so we put a lot of emphasis on planning. I believe President Eisenhower is the one that said the plan isn't what's important, it's the planning that's important, and that's where the relationships are made and the business cards are exchanged beforehand so that when the disaster occurs, you already have that relationship, because that becomes very important during the response itself. And so the department puts a lot of emphasis on that planning to identify the capabilities, not only at the federal level, but the capabilities that exist at the state level as well as the local level, to determine what's the most effective and efficient way to provide that support. We also are taking on some initiatives to posture DoD capabilities for rapid response. We have delegated authority where we can to enable the department to respond quicker, and we have capabilities resident throughout the nation. Many of the local authorities have very close relationships with installations in their jurisdictions, and those capabilities of the department are there and are able to respond at the request of local officials. And so many times those people can be the first ones to respond in uniform. The National Guard is a very, very important part of that response effort also, working for the governor. And as you heard, the governor has the responsibility for that response. And the National Guard is postured and ready to do that on a day-to-day basis. So leveraging the total force, and then are spending a considerable amount of time on education, training, and exercising to ensure that the department is ready to respond when called upon so that we can meet the needs of the American public. That's all. Thank you, sir.
All right. All right, now it's time to take questions. We got our microphone folks up and ready. So, does someone have the first question, or do I get to ask the first one? All right, sir, get the mic first.
Should I stand or?
No, you just stay seated. Just let us know who you are and then ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Lincoln Smith, retired Navy here, and what a great panel. Thank you so much. Focusing on one of the recommendations here, communications, critical challenge in the report, and I guess I might direct this to Daniel. During your time, really two questions here. How is the strategic communication effort coming, and how did it work out during Katrina?
And to clarify, you mean public communications, or you mean like first responder?
Absolutely.
Radio communications.
Not first responder, but public communication.
Public
You betcha. It would be the latter, not the former.
So public communications is an area that, was certainly a challenge during Hurricane Katrina. I think we can all acknowledge that. And the challenge with Katrina was there was a lack of situational awareness. Fundamentally, all of the problems that I witnessed in the White House, and certainly there were many other challenges, in New Orleans that I wasn't aware of. But the fundamental challenge was of situational awareness. And what that means is we didn't know what was going on in New Orleans. And in a funny kind of way, the public communications is directly related to the communications network. Because if if those communications networks in Louisiana were functioning, we would have had some situational awareness and would have been able to better articulate, the federal government would have been able to better articulate what was going on and, to the American public. Oftentimes when we talk about lessons learned from 9/11 to Katrina on communications, I say, at 9/11 we knew that first responder radios were not communicating with each other. The police couldn't talk to the firefighters. That was an issue of interoperability. In other words, they couldn't interoperate, right? In Katrina, it was an issue of operability. There was none, right? So really what it took for us to have any idea what was going on in New Orleans was when the media finally was able to provide, frankly, images on TV that we saw for the first time. Then that can inform our public communications people, the press secretary at DHS, or the White House press secretary, and they could effectively communicate this to the American public. But yeah, huge challenge, and frankly, when you don't know what's going on, it's almost impossible. I will say that has improved dramatically in a couple different ways since Katrina, in the sense that we now have something called social media. Social media really wasn't around in 2005. Today, I have no doubt that if there was a major disaster, people will be tweeting constantly. Especially helpful if people are tweeting from that disaster zone with pictures or descriptions of what's going on. That can give you a lot better situational awareness. No matter where you are in the country or even in the world, you can have good insights into what's happening in that area.
Coach, you got anything you want to add to that?
Just a quick follow-on, Dan. One of the recommendations was to develop a national emergency communication strategy. Has that been developed, or is it already there and it's maybe a work in progress?
Sure, and that's a recommendation in the Katrina report.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so there certainly have been strategies. There's the National Communication System for the radios, and there are public affairs type trainings that have definitely taken place since Katrina, where there's an entire outreach effort now, external affairs outreach effort, where I would say huge improvements. I wish FEMA was here. FEMA could do, convene conference calls with their fellow public affairs coordinators throughout the federal government to make sure that there are an effective, unified communications message out there.
I'll just add on to that. They do Emergency Support Function 15 as external affairs, and FEMA routinely exercises that emergency support function for real world and also for exercises. And all the departments that are in the National Response Framework participate in that, as do state and local public affairs representatives and representatives from the governor's office and all the responding officials. So that there's the communication that takes place from all levels of government to ensure what is the public message and ensure that flow of information does occur. And so they have a number of phone calls that take place, conference calls, nickel calls, and a few other acronyms that I can't really explain what they are, but I do know that our public affairs representatives within the Department of Defense are actively involved in that, and not only at the Pentagon, but at Northern Command also very closely. And so that does take place very routinely.
And I'm going to succumb to the temptation, because I always do, to add something to that as well, because I have been working in this kind of system. Keep in mind, there's always going to be this problem of people in the government who actually have responsibility for this stuff are always going to lag behind the news, because the people in government actually have a responsibility to gather all the facts and portray it accurately, whereas the news can just grab a picture and throw it out there and say, this is what's going on right now. We think it's this. Whereas the government, in all of its incarnations, actually cares about portraying it correctly. I'm not talking about hiding anything or anything like that. We had the same thing with the military. A bomb would go off somewhere overseas, and it's playing on CNN, and I'd get a call in the front office of the Pentagon from the White House saying, what's going on in country X? And I said, I don't know. The people who are out there looking at it haven't reported it yet. Well, it's on CNN. I said, well, that's nice, but they're not a definitive source. And so there's a real tyranny now. Social media makes it even more urgent. And, so there's always going to be a little lag that should never be read as some malintent on the part of the government, but they really try and get it right before they go public with it. So they're getting faster and faster all the time. All right, another question. Yeah, Rebecca.
Rachel Zismos, Heritage Foundation. How can the training of dual commanders contribute to emergency planning and response?
I take it that's directed for me. Dual, you're talking about dual status commanders
Yes.
that operate within the state during response. For those who don't know, dual status commander is an individual that's appointed, has a commission in both the state that he's operating in or she's operating in. At the same time, they have a commission in the federal service. So that hence the dual status. They're operating in a Title X status and also in a state status at the same time. So it's not something that we do all the time. It is now authorized for contingency responses, which it was not previously. We had done it for a number of pre-planned events, starting with Sea Island, Georgia, during one of the big events that took place down there. But it is a way to operationalize, and the idea is to be able to achieve a unity of effort by having someone who has situation awareness on what's going on the state side as well as what's going on the federal side, so that they can better position the forces that they have to meet the demands of the response effort itself. So the flexibility that the dual status commander has is tremendous when it comes to operating within the state. They have whatever their state authorizes them to have as far as the ability within the state constitution to do what they want with the forces. With the Title X force, they have some flexibility, but it's somewhat limited because that force is actually executing a mission assignment from FEMA, okay, that has a specific task at a specific cost over a specific period of time. And so there's not, and that is the legal authority for the Department of Defense to take action. And so deviating from that, we start to put our forces at risk when they start to deviate from that. And so legally, they can't really deviate from that assignment. So it is a way to achieve unity of effort, and it is an option that the state and the federal side have to choose to operate in that manner.
All right, another question. All right, I get to ask one. Good, you guys can think up some more. All right, this one, David, you get to go first on this. Do improvements on the federal level, whether it be preparations or organizational changes, that sort of thing, does that actually somewhat undercut or sort of give permission to the state and the local guys to sort of lay back a little bit? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I do.
You know, so basically, should the federal government sort of back off from this stuff and not prepare? And therefore give tough love to the states and locals and get them to do more? Or is that irresponsible?
I think the answer is sort of, it's not exactly, I wouldn't portray it exactly that way. We do need, I think, the federal government to be involved in fewer disasters, but that's so that the federal government can be better prepared for the disasters that it does respond to. The states, I know, some states are more prepared than others. I think we need to have each state taking a look at what it can be doing to prepare for the disasters that are unique to that state. The state and locals are going to probably have the best handle on that, and then the ways in which FEMA, Department of Defense, can support that state in their efforts, especially during a time of a catastrophe, a large-scale disaster. That's when we want FEMA to be able to step forward. So it's not that FEMA is going to step back and say tough love on everything. There's an important role that FEMA is going to play, but we want them to be better prepared for the larger disasters.
You guys know?
Yeah, I certainly think that there is a potential for moral hazard here, where the federal government spends an unlimited amount of money or continue to spend more and more money preparing for disasters, the incentive for state and local governments to prepare goes down, right? So there's a correlation in my mind between those two issues, which is federal government's very prepared, state will allocate its funding for disaster response elsewhere. And I don't have any empirical evidence of that, but I suspect that's happening. I mean, state budgets are very tight, and the states can't afford to either invest in disaster response activities, especially for those, again, those low probability, high consequence events. And two, they can't just simply set aside money in the event they need it for a disaster response. Whereas at the federal government, at the federal level, we do that. We set aside money every year, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, into the disaster relief fund, because the federal government, believes that it's in the country's best interest to have funding available to respond to disasters, to provide immediate assistance. How many states do that? And how many states adequately fund those programs? I'd say very few. So I think we're already risking moral hazard. And to the extent that we can encourage the states to invest more in these preparedness activities, the better off we will all be, and the less reliant we'll become on the federal government.
Just one thing I'll add to that is that, again, the Department of Defense is not funded for any support of civil authorities' activities, but the belief from the Department of Defense is that the activities that we take to perform our defense mission easily translate to that support. And so the things that we do, whether you're driving a fuel truck in Afghanistan or a truck full of water in Illinois, you're still driving a truck. And so the training that we do for our wartime mission and our defense missions easily translates to support for civil authorities. And so what we are looking at very closely is the concept of preparedness, and what does that mean for the Department of Defense. We have readiness. We measure that. We exercise that. We do that all the time. We know whether we're ready or not to perform our missions to support the defense of the United States. But how does that translate into preparedness, and how does the Department of Defense do preparedness, and how do we do it without any increases to our budget so that we can support civil authorities? So that's what I'll have to say on that.
Okay. Questions? Okay.
Bill Merkel, Heritage Foundation. This question is mainly for James Ross. You mentioned full-time DoD officials at FEMA that help work through the set of criteria for legality for DoD participation. Is there a similar system for overseas disaster response?
There is an office, and there is a similar system for overseas disasters run through the State Department and USAID. And so when DoD is providing support to civil authorities overseas, it's usually through USAID and their work with the local, the government where the disaster has occurred. And so they in turn ask DoD to provide assistance and then reimburse the department for that assistance. So many times overseas, what you see a lot of the department doing is logistics support, strategic movement of commodities to the disaster area. You saw it with the Philippines with the disaster that took place in there, where we brought supplies in via C-130s. And then also, once we get the naval forces into the area, they can provide tremendous capabilities sitting off the coast. You saw that with Indonesia after the tsunami that took place, and then also in Japan after the earthquake and tsunami that took place, where we had naval forces that were providing support from the sea to the impacted areas.
I'm going to ask a related question, and this I'm violating the thing of before you ask a question, you should always know what the answer is, because I don't know the answer to this one. One of the things that I saw when I was in the Pentagon when we did Katrina, when we did some of these other things, was suddenly, for I think the first time in our country's history, we had other countries offering us aid, and we had no clue what to do with it, how to use it, who did we trust, who we didn't trust, or I guess, Coach, for you, but Dan, you're looking at it a lot too. Are we any better at that aspect of it? I mean, everybody hopes, God forbid, we never need that help from another country. But if we do, have we incorporated that system into our procedures?
I'm happy to take first cut. So during Hurricane Katrina, Steve is absolutely right. We had no ability, we, the federal government at the time, had no ability to accept donations, either monetary or physical goods or services from foreign countries. It had never been done before. So obviously, two of the recommendations in the lessons learned report were for the State Department to develop protocols for accepting monetary gifts as well as goods and services. And I know while I was there, we did oversee that process, and the State Department did develop processes and procedures for accepting those gifts. And you might say, well, why have we never had that situation before? Well, because we're the U.S. We provide assistance to other countries during their disasters. We never contemplated needing that assistance from others. But just as important is whenever there's a disaster, everybody wants to help. We see that at the local and community levels where bystanders try to help and sometimes end up getting in the way and making it more difficult for the professional responders. Right? There's nothing wrong with people wanting to help, but sometimes there's a difference between wanting to help and what's helpful. So, example, getting goods and services from a foreign country seems like a great idea, right? Well, is that something, were those really needed by those responders on the ground? And in many cases, they weren't. It would be, pallets of clothing, let's say, that people felt, a need to donate clothing. Well, people didn't need clothing, or maybe the clothing wasn't appropriate for that environment. Or there were regulatory issues. For example, medical teams were being flown in from foreign countries. Those medical teams were not credentialed by to U.S. standards. So you can't have a physician from a foreign country come and treat someone in the U.S. That's not something that could happen at the time. Or two, it could be something like food. You say, well, why couldn't we accept food donations? Well, importing food into the U.S. falls under the U.S. Department of Agriculture that heavily regulates for good reason, what type of food and what standards the food has to meet before being imported in the U.S. to make sure that we don't create a bigger problem than the situation we had on the ground. So, anyways, yes, lots of challenges, something that nobody anticipated. We personally oversaw the development of those protocols at the White House. We oversaw the State Department's development of those protocols at the White House, and then perhaps we can hear what is happening today.
Well, there is a system in place to allow for that to happen. It is routinely exercised now with the what is now called the National Exercise Program capstone event every other year. So the most recent one was an Alaska earthquake and tsunami scenario that we did last spring, and they exercised that process. So the State Department and FEMA are the ones that determine basically what assistance will be accepted and how it will be provided.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Right here.
Hi, Brett Rappaport. Just a quick statement. Daniel, based on what you've experienced in Katrina in New Jersey, when Sandy happened, some of the towns like mine that had good leadership learned lessons from past events, and we reacted appropriately and very quickly. Other towns that had poor leadership didn't have power, they didn't know the right municipality utilities to call, they didn't know how to deal with the governor's office or anywhere else. So their towns suffered longer than, say, mine, which had its power and other resources up almost immediately. And a question I have for James. When we use the National Guard overseas, does that impact us here in being able to respond in using the Guard for something like a Katrina? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. In Katrina, as you probably remember, there were Louisiana Guardsmen that were deployed, and the department at that time made a decision to bring those Guardsmen back as quickly as possible so that they could be home and be prepared to support the state and their families with the disaster. So when the department, and I'm not the expert in it, so I know that the Joint Staff is the arbiter, and they are the ones that manage what we call the global force management process. So which forces go where and when they go for rotations and so forth. I do not know, and I would be wrong to say I knew, whether or not they look at that as part of the criteria. I do not believe that they do. The assumption is that the states will have an adequate resource still within the state. So we don't send 100% of a state's resources overseas at any one time. I do know we don't do that. but there is a schedule that is planned out. And states also, as I said before, have access through Emergency Management Assistance Compact to have capabilities come from other states to support them. So even if they have a capability that's deployed overseas, another state has a capability that can provide that support to the governor when it's requested.
And-
If I might add, EMAC was heavily used during Katrina.
Right.
Virtually every state provided assistance, and in many cases it was National Guardsmen
And,
from other
and
states.
after Katrina, we got smarter about that. For Katrina, we just said, hey, we need a lot of help. Who's got these kind of units? We brought them all in. After Katrina, the National Guard Bureau took it on themselves to manage day by day. And they look at, every state had a separate chart where they said, okay, if they get a Category 5 hurricane, what do they need? Okay, they're gonna need some help on a Category 5. Category 3, they got everything in the state today that they need. And if something came out of the state, either to deploy overseas or to do a training exercise, they had to not just depend on, yeah, there's somebody else out there that could do this. They knew the exact unit. That unit had been notified and was on call that should scenario X occur in state B, your truck company was gonna get deployed there to backfill this truck company that was off doing something else. They've really made a science. First, it was a nug drill. I mean, it was literally guys every day on a table with charts moving little, truck company blocks around. Now it's computerized, but the National Guard Bureau manages that for DOD so that every state has the force package we think they would need ahead of time, preset, notified, ready to move should something happen. So and the Louisiana one, part of that decision was not just to serve Louisiana, it was because they were concerned that those guardsmen, they're in a fight, but they're thinking about mom and dad and the kids back home who are underwater now. So some of that was a decision, not just to bring those folks back to participate in the operations, but because they were affected citizens as well as soldiers. So the DOD does a really good job taking all of that into effect. All right. Yes, you have a question. I don't know if that's fair. You have the microphone. We've never done that before, but okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm an intern here at Heritage. I go to school up in Jersey, and my question is for anyone who wants it. But could you give a brief overview, a little compare and contrast between FEMA's effectiveness and response in Hurricane Katrina and Sandy?
You look at me? Okay. So they were very different disasters. I'll give you maybe a pro and a con here. So a pro is, for the first time, FEMA exercised its ability to deploy all of its headquarters personnel to a disaster scene. So remember when I said mainly, you have the disaster reservists responding, meaning they're activated only in a disaster. In this case, the FEMA administrator decided to deploy headquarters personnel. And I think the pro is that's great, right, to try out that program. The con was a lot of those folks didn't have adequate training and they're not operationally focused. They might have gone from processing payments for disasters to now, outreach to community outreach or commodities distribution. So I think, again, I think there's a pro and con there from FEMA. Another major difference from an operational standpoint is, I'd say in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, when all of the disaster victims have been rescued and the people of New York and New Jersey were still facing a long and difficult journey on disaster recovery, the number one challenge was power, the ability to have their homes powered. Whereas in Katrina, that wasn't an issue. It wasn't nearly the scale of that issue. And the reason why is because we evacuated eventually, with pre and post disaster, people from the New Orleans area. So absolutely the power was knocked out, but there was nobody there that needed the power at the time. People in harm's way had been moved out. Whereas in New York and New Jersey, people wanted to continue forward with their lives. They didn't want to move out of their house. They didn't want to be relocated to far off areas like in Katrina, people were relocated all around the country. So that was, I think, a particular challenge and a different challenge. And I think there were definitely some lessons about how to get power restored in a major metropolitan area, a very densely populated major metropolitan area, for people whose homes were not destroyed, they were habitable, but they needed power. And I'll turn it over to my DoD friend, because DoD played a major role in helping restore power to many of the Sandy victims.
Power was definitely a key issue, and in July of 2012, in fact, I think it was today, in 2012, July 20th, the then Secretary issued a memorandum to the department to begin to look at what we call a complex catastrophe. And that's an event that's, General Jacoby, the former commander at Northern Command, said, Sandy was not a complex catastrophe, but I could see a complex catastrophe from Sandy. It was close. It was getting there. And that was the aspect of the power and the fuel issues that the second, and what the complex catastrophe is like, you start to get second and third order effects from the disaster itself. So I have damage, which creates problems with power, which then creates additional problems with fuel distribution and communications and other effects that begin to take place. And so from a Sandy standpoint, we were approaching that. We never got there, but we were approaching that. So the Department of Defense, Sandy was unique. It was a major metropolitan area. The density of population, we had high rises. We had never seen something like that before. Usually you don't have that concentration. One of the other things that was very eye-opening for the response was competing priorities, because you had federal priorities, you also had state priorities, and you also had city priorities. And a lot of times they didn't necessarily agree. And so how do we respond as a government when we have competing priorities and limited resources to do so? And so, but I would say FEMA has made a considerable effort to be much better prepared. They realize that in the response, what we call the requirements generation process is a bottom-up driven process. So it starts at the lowest levels of government and works its way up through the various levels to the federal government. The ability to respond in a timely manner relies on that process to work quickly and efficiently. It's not designed to do so. And so FEMA made a concerted effort to put more people out into the field to assist with identifying those requirements, to work through the Joint Field Office into the federal apparatus to get the response there quickly. And so from that aspect, I think they did a much better job, and Mr. Fugate also had set a tone within FEMA, what he called go big, go fast, go smart. And so not necessarily sitting back, and that's one of the lessons from Katrina, is we don't want, the federal government shouldn't have to wait all the time. If there's a need, the government should have the ability to respond. And in Sandy, Mr. Fugate exercised that authority and began to anticipate what the requirements would be and began to push resources and capabilities forward before they were asked. And so that was a big difference also.
Okay, I have a closing question that you guys can use to your advantage to close this out. And quick, concise answers. But I'd like you to give me the one adjustment you think we could make to the federal system, anywhere in the federal system. You could pick organizations you worked for or work in or someplace else. What's the one thing we could do to make our response to disasters better? And you could, any aspect of better that you want to, faster, more efficient, whatever.
I guess we'll go this way. My answer is sort of pretty obvious. It's what I've been saying. I think when I look at the Stafford Act, I would like to see. I think the Stafford Act would be the single thing I would change, both from a fiscal perspective for the United States. The disaster relief fund has been growing significantly over the past several years, ever since the Stafford Act was put into place, and I think reversing that trend of the disaster relief fund constantly needing to grow to fund more and more disaster response is something I would do from a fiscal perspective, but also to improve the preparedness of state and local governments and maintain FEMA for the most catastrophic disasters.
He took mine. Okay. I would say public education and expectation setting for the American public. What I mean by that is, listen, the federal government's not going to be there immediately following a disaster. No matter how much better prepared we are following Hurricanes Katrina or Sandy or any other disaster, even if we embrace all of those lessons, even if we throw the entire federal budget at it, the federal government still plays a supporting role, and in that role, they're not going to be there first. So it's incumbent upon you as an individual and you as a member of your community to make sure that you have the ability to sustain yourself and your family and your friends for a period of time. FEMA will tell you that that period of time is 72 hours. You know, I would say it's at least that long. I think for a truly catastrophic disaster, you might be on your own longer. So please just don't expect FEMA or anybody else from the federal government to come riding in and saving you in your time of need during a catastrophic disaster. It's just not the same as during a non-disaster scenario where you pick up the phone, dial 911, and help arrives from your local government. Realize that help might not arrive for hours or days, and you need to be prepared to again, sustain yourself, your family, your friends for a period of time.
I would say a truly integrated planning program where we look at not only what the federals have to offer, but the state, local, tribal, private sector, NGOs, an integrated planning effort where everybody comes to the table as an honest broker and says, here's the capabilities that I have and here's what can be used to respond. And we plan based upon those capabilities, and that gives us the ability to identify where the shortfalls are beforehand and who is going to respond to meet that capability when it can't be handled at the local level or can't be handled at the state level. And so it takes all parties to do that. We're making progress there. We're not there yet, but we're getting better at it each day.
All right, well, folks, we may fight wars in the future. We all pray we don't. I have to tell you, though, we will face disasters in the future. That is not a maybe. They happen, whether they're natural or man-made or just an accident. We're going to have disasters. So this is an important subject. It's one that we need to keep our arms around, and you're going to keep improving and adjusting as we go. But I'd ask you to join me in thanking the panel for an interesting discussion on this. Thank you very much for coming here to Heritage.